Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the System Expansion Modeling Workshop. My name is Debbie Liu. I'm the Executive Director of ESIG. And for those of you who are familiar with ESIG, we are a member-driven organization that addresses technical challenges for transforming energy systems. And we do this through collaboration and peer learning. And I urge you, go to our website at esig.energy, go to our YouTube channel. We have workshops, webinars, blogs, reports for free. And the way we work is through task forces. And we have a task force on integrated planning. Erin is going to describe that later today. And you should keep an eye out next year for a guidebook and some thought leadership pieces on optimization around the topic that we're discussing today. So if I say the words integrated planning to any of you, you'll all have different ideas in your mind as to what that means, right? Some people are thinking gas and electric coordination. Some people are thinking industry, hydrogen. What we're going to focus on today is this piece here, basically focused around generation and the load. So that includes storage, includes DERs, includes electrification, and transmission and distribution, that dimension. And that's going to be the focus of this workshop. So traditionally, when we do resource planning, we use capacity expansion models, right? We use that to find the least cost generation solution. However, for transmission planning or distribution planning, that's performed very differently, right? It doesn't start with capacity expansion model. But today's system is more interactive, right? Today, generation needs transmission, and transmission between diverse regions can reduce the need for generation. And if I have flexibility in my load, that could reduce the need for a distribution upgrade. So an aspirational view today could be a kind of holistic perspective across generation, transmission, distribution, and the customer or load. Now, there's a lot of folks developing new tools. That's great. I do want to point out we can do a lot with existing tools. For example, we know that remote wind and solar resources require transmission. Well, we can co-optimize generation transmission in many of today's existing tools. We had a whole workshop on this 2 years ago. You can see the videos and presentations from that. Modeling over larger regions could show how transmission could reduce the need for generation, right? Because if we can have regions of diversity be connected with transmission, we might not need as much generation to meet resource adequacy needs. We know that DERs, typically they're used as an input in these modeling, but they could be a resource instead. It could be a solution, part of the solution set. And then there are things like retail rates, right? Retail rates, time of use rates act sort of like storage. Critical peak pricing acts sort of like a peaking plant, right? Even those could be modeled as resources in a capacity expansion model. So there are things we could do to sort of force fit capacity expansion models to do some of what we'd like them to do. But there's a lot still that we cannot do, especially when we think about the distribution system, right? Thinking about how to consider hosting capacity constraints for rooftop solar on the distribution system, or how do you include the cost of distribution upgrades in your optimization? And more broadly, let's say your system needs storage. Do you put that storage on the transmission system or on the distribution system? And we don't really have tools today that help us make those decisions. And then finally, there's many types of loads that can provide different types of flexibility, whether it's a response to rates or prices or programs, but how do you incorporate flexible load more generally? So today we're going to dive into these types of questions, and we have a packed agenda this afternoon. So Dr. Bryan Palmintier from NREL is going to talk about integration across the transmission distribution system. Dr. Chris Clack is going to talk about the wisdom model that can be used in co-optimizing across generation, transmission, and distribution. Luke Falla, who very graciously woke up at 5:30 this morning to join this workshop, from the Australian Energy Market Operator is going to talk about their integrated system plan. Dr. Schuyler Matteson from the New York Department of Public Service is going to talk about coordinated grid planning that they're doing in New York State. Obadiah Bartholomy from SMUD is going to talk about incorporation of DER contributions into resource planning. And then finally, Aaron Burdick from E3 is going to give some closing remarks around our integrated planning task force. And I would like to acknowledge and give thanks to Breakthrough Energy for sponsoring this workshop. They've sponsored this, and we're going to have follow-on virtual workshops also on integrated planning in the future. I also want to say, if you have any questions you want to ask of a presenter, please type them into the Q&A box and send them to the panelists. And we've got time at the end of each presentation for Q&A. And everything's recorded, and you'll get all the presentations, so you can just sit back and listen. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Bryan. Let's see, how do I do this?
Hi there, everyone. My name is Bryan Palmintier. I'm calling in from Golden, Colorado, where I work at NREL. And just to kick off this virtual workshop, I'm going to talk a bit about integration across the transmission and distribution scales. And this is part of that broader vision of when I'm thinking about generation optimization across generation, transmission, distribution, and customer. I wanted to highlight, though, that we're talking about scales because sometimes people, when we say T&D, are thinking mostly about wires. But here the goal is really to be thinking more broadly about everything at those different scales, bulk versus distribution. So thanks, Debbie, for the introduction, and definitely very much looking forward to the other presenters too. Should be an exciting workshop. So to go ahead and get started, I wanted to sort of set the stage of thinking about how, as it stands today, we kind of have a lot of really great planning and optimization happening, but really often in silos among those 4 different categories. And sort of acknowledge that those are as a fantastic starting point. And we're already starting to see an increasing amount of, I would call it partial integration. Debbie already talked about the generation and transmission getting together, the increasing integrated resource plans, and of course, lots of other aspects that are driving that. On the distribution side, often distribution and customer, there's starting to be a bit more effort on integrated distribution planning, things like hosting capacity, other pieces there. But there's still kind of this divide here between the bulk side and the distribution side. So I wanted to highlight a few thoughts and kind of get the conversation started around how we might think about and approaches we might take for optimizing in that space. So as it stands now, we're also starting to see an increase of kind of reaching over the wall from the maybe IRP side to capture a bit more about what's happening on particularly the customer side. What's really happening there, customers as well as distribution and smaller connected resources that may or may not be directly from customers. But I think we're a potential future state is to really say, hey, wait, if we get all 4 of these areas together, we can really accelerate this ongoing transition, lower costs, improve reliability, resilience. We can kind of actually capture all the values that are separated and lost when in more traditional planning approaches. So we're talking today about optimization, economic optimization across these. And so a starting point for a lot of that work is the modeling context. So I wanted to very quickly sort of throw out a couple of different ways of describing how we might be pulling these together, and then use some examples that talk about some past projects that we've done here, as well as some ongoing work to kind of stimulate the conversation. So in concept, we're talking about T&D getting together and exchanging data. And as you kind of show here, we're generation, transmission, that bulk side often together, distribution and customer kind of often together too. And so, one way that this can be done is similar to what Debbie described earlier. A lot of times it's kind of this once through workflow. Some level of distribution analysis is treated as an input into bulk grid optimization. So this might be things like exogenous adoption models for customer resources, for load projections. It could even include things like flexibility profiles or cost curves for integration. But a lot of times it's really just a one-way flow. Another thing that can be done is to co-model, to think about putting the distribution portion within a larger bulk grid model. A great example of this is what is often done on more of an engineering context, but certainly still part of the planning process, when we get into power flow models and aggregated load and DERA and similar types of aggregated models for fairly complex things at the distribution level are put together into a single model there. There's also efforts to try to pull all these things into one big optimization, which is another approach, but often there's a little bit of a sort of not exactly intentional with the figures here, but it is implied, this idea of the square peg round hole, because a lot of times we start running into challenges where the details that start to matter on one scale or another don't all fit in the same paradigm. So there can be some challenges with a co-modeling approach. Another thing which we're starting to see an increased amount of now is the idea of like, hey, we've got multiple tools, the bulk side, distribution side. If we have a chance for these to iterate a bit, then we might find a solution that's a bit different than these other approaches. We've done some work like this. You'll see a bit at NREL, using sort of expansion planning models to understand potential cost and rate trajectories and having those impact adoption models for the distribution side, feeding those back in, as well as you could be doing this on the other parts of the economic with upgrades for distribution. And in some ways, kind of the holy grail that, as Debbie also alluded to, may be challenging computationally, but might be an opportunity as we look ahead, is to do more optimization, or in some cases co-simulation, where in practice, you've got a set of tools, perhaps more than one at each of these different scales, with wrappers around them, kind of automated exchange of data and coordination of these processes in a space where you can kind of push go, watch, make sure things are going well, and have a lot of these interactions happen without as much intervention as might be expected in like the number 3 thing we're showing here. So a place where we did a lot of integrated analysis that many folks, but perhaps not everybody on the call may be familiar with, was a project we completed a little while ago with the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, looking at pathways to 100% renewables. And this was a very in-depth project. And we could spend this whole webinar on just talking about LA100, so we're not going to do that. Instead, I'm just going to highlight that this was a deep dive on a lot of different fronts. We did very granular modeling of all the load, EV, DER, buildings, including individual building models, and trying to map those out as representative buildings into locations on the city, as well as more traditional capacity expansion, interacting with resource adequacy, lots of detailed production cost, all these across many scenarios for long time horizons. And we did a lot of work on the distribution effort as well, where we looked at power flow models for 90% of the 1,500 feeders in their service territory across a lot of different scenarios, looked at the upgrades that might be needed as a result, and continued even to some of the other strong impacts on a societal level of air quality, jobs, and other aspects. So there's a whole lot of work that went on in this space. But since we're here to talk about this more integration and the T&D space, wanted to, we'll quickly provide a quick summary of the scenarios, then we'll talk a little bit about sort of what was happening behind the scenes. So first, there's lots and lots of results here. I've got the web link at the bottom to dig into, but it figured it'd be unfair to at least to mention the project without at least a few sort of outcomes. And some of these may be fairly obvious, but there was a significant amount more of electrification, both customer and utility side, renewable resources, as well as a lot of storage, distribution, and transmission. All of those were significantly increases. The details can be found in the reports. And then one of the challenges of getting from about 90% in this case to 100% was having some form of clean dispatchable technology, which we captured as some form of renewably fueled combustion turbines. Number of different scenarios, some had biofuels, some didn't. You could imagine this eventually being fuel cells. But to get that last 10% and to manage resource adequacy in some transmission constraint situations, that was a key technology need. Anyway, as I mentioned, we're going to spend less time talking about the results and more time talking about kind of the how. So first step of any of these large studies, as most folks are familiar, is a lot of data collection and scenario development. Then after that was something that I put this little icon in the corner. You'll see a few of those throughout the presentation. Fits with that first paradigm of kind of a one-way flow from the distribution and customer scales up to the bulk scale analysis. And so this was done with load growth and demand profiles, renewable resources that included some bulk resources too, as well as some estimates of distribution system hosting capacity. But if you stop at hosting capacity, you're kind of missing the fact that it may be fairly efficient, fast, and cost-wise to do upgrades on the distribution system as well to support resources. So we did some pre-work to understand cost curves for some of the larger scale resources that might be connected to the distribution system, so we could use those to inform some of the placement within the capacity expansion modeling that was happening at the bulk level. So quick slides on those, lots of load modeling. This included a number of different tools we have at NREL. As I mentioned before, we did deep dives on buildings with res stock and comstock. This was tens of thousands of representative buildings and doing full weather patterns and occupancy scenarios to come up with load profiles, aggregate and calibrate those to historic data. At the same time, think about what end uses and other technologies might provide some flexibility. So that can be provided, again, in this somewhat more one way at this stage into the model for use to dispatch. Transportation the same way, industrial, and then also other loads. This included in this particular case things like some agricultural pieces that were within the area, as well as water loads, which are kind of between the industrial and gap. The adoption of distributed resources on the customer side, we used a tool called DGen, which has representative agents and demographics down to, as well as parcel scale matching. So you take a whole bunch of agents and then map them out at a things like census tract level for aggregation into the larger scale models for bulk system, and then down into the parcel model to populate the distribution system with lots of different scenarios, because we're not quite sure where people are going to adopt. So we have to look at a few different patterns and understand what those upgrade needs might be. Also on the distribution cost I mentioned before, trying to build up some cost curves. Thankfully, trying to stay within that quantifiable cost domain as described here, because at some point you start to think about step changes with systematic pieces, which are a bit of a challenge when we, especially in this T goes straight to D as an external input, is that ADMS system or that DERM system upgrade, like how do you account for that unless you're doing it at a big system level? So back to steps. After that, then we moved into that bulk capacity expansion effort, including decisions where some of the resources within the basin, within the LA basin, might be needing to be sited on distribution, but because of spatial constraints, they were going to have to be in the basin. So there were some expansion of the bulk system model of distribution connected resources that would be front of the meter to augment those that would be behind the meter passed in exogenously from DGen, as I described a little bit earlier. This is a space where I have the little icon here of some iteration, particularly on the transmission to transmission side. We'll talk about in a second. There's a little bit of distribution iteration. We only kind of got through one cycle on that effort. But the other iterations occurred with the performance of the operations, things like stability, as well as some of the validation of operations. And so this, I think, is a good example of that third example. We have iterative analysis between tools. Here, primarily on the bulk side, I did mention before, though, we did on the distribution or customer to bulk side connection around a single pass around the pricing of potential rate changes and their impacts on adoption that then fed into that exogenous model for distribution, as well as the cost curves. But fairly traditional approach here, but with expanded scale, especially from the time this was done, of having iterative, tight iterations with the resource adequacy to capacity expansion. Also, then moving into once those capacity pieces were settled out, thinking about production costs to see if there are congestion or other challenges, and then even into the power flow to identify some of the more technical constraints. I highlight here that the power flow is a space, as I mentioned before, that fits that second type of approach, where distribution is kind of embedded within the transmission model at a very simplified representation. Just for completeness on the project here, I mentioned a number of these environmental, job, and economic type impacts. Those were then done as the post-processing after all the other steps. And if you want to dig in more on LA100, then here's the link to look about it. In addition to the more technical original LA100 study, we also recently, about a year ago, completed an equity strategies follow-on, thinking about making sure that disadvantaged communities and all Angelenos are able to participate in this transition towards a cleaner future for the city. But wanted to not stop with LA100 because there's been a lot of efforts and learnings as a result of that seem relevant to share with this audience too. So the first one, perhaps not in order of time because this came out very recently, is the National Transmission Planning Study. You can see the link at the bottom. For those of you who are not aware, there's a lot of effort to think about interregional and national scale strategies around transmission. One might argue that this was not a particularly strong connection between transmission and distribution, since the focus was on the transmission side. There were some of those flow-ins of DER adoption and load models and other aspects that we see in a lot of the bulk studies, but it was kind of more of a one-way street. I did want to include it though, because one of the topics that we'll talk about more later, but just for if you're looking for information, you don't have time to join us in the future, is one of the challenges when we talk about the different scales is that often the transmission scale is already working at big zones and then sometimes down to the nodal level. And even that transition is hard, getting from zones to the nodes within an actual transmission grid. And there's a similar, if not more challenging, to get that even a step further down to the distribution scale. So here for the National Transmission Planning Study, the focus was on zonal to nodal for the bulk system. And so there's some interesting work to look at in there in terms of integrated modeling in general. But getting to distribution, think about, oh, wait, now we have to do this down to distribution feeders, and in some cases, depending on the kind of questions at hand, the resources we're looking at, even all the way down to the customer, or at least down to service transformers, or down to the portion of the line. All of those have similar challenges and conundrums that come up to what we see with zonal to nodal, which is already a hard problem today. The other sort of to help balance that out on the flip side, while there's been increased efforts on integration between transmission and generation, there's also been a lot of efforts on the integrated distribution planning, and in particular, recognizing that, hey, we need to maybe think about if we're going to try to capture distribution, value streams, and distributed energy resources within these larger scale system planning studies. They may be running at different time horizons, only a few years perhaps for distribution versus 10, 20 or beyond in some cases for the bulk system. And the sort of sometimes distribution has historically been more reactionary to expected load growth in small areas. And so there's been a recent realization and a lot of effort, including many of the folks on this call. So to start to say, hey, wait, we can push this further and really do something that looks more like system scale capacity planning on the distribution side to complement that economic optimization that's happening on the transmission side, economic optimization on both sides with somewhat longer time horizons. Historically, the tools available for distribution don't necessarily do that, since they tend to be power flow and engineering focused. There is some work going on at NREL, along with a number of partners you see listed there on the left, building out more of a capacity planning tool that says, well, maybe we don't always need power flow, similar to the fact we don't always do nodal power flow in our capacity expansion optimization. Maybe there's an opportunity for things like sometimes you need power flow, but sometimes you might need more of a connectivity or even a feeder level representation to get at a little bit more resolution on the distribution side than might be historically done. So exciting things ongoing there with Cadet, and you'll see some more results of that in coming sessions in the future. Another effort, I mentioned data being a key challenge. The Global Power System Transformation Consortium has got an ongoing work to try to recognize, hey, how can we get interoperable data among all these different pieces? Having specifications, tool interfaces, as well as then the ability for these tools to work more closely together. And then the last thing I wanted to close with, there's still a few slides on these, is thinking about kind of that fourth example of bringing the bulk side with the distribution side together through multi-model frameworks. And so highlight a few of those. One that came directly out of LA 100 was the recognition that in strong and complex workflows, as you start to go beyond, even within the traditional say bulk side or distribution side, there's tons of data that's being handed off between tools. But as we get more integrated, it's more teams, more tools, different ways of thinking about things, different units, different time conventions. For example, the transportation people often just think about a weekend day and a weekday. But then how do you map that to something like an 8760? Well, I mean, you can assume, okay, all the weekends and holidays are one thing, but does that really capture the true dynamics? So there's a lot of nuance to getting those handoffs to work well. And the pipes model was one that grew directly out of what we ran into in LA 100 of like, some team would do a nice job of improving the results of what they did within their portion of the analysis and then try to pass it on. But oh wait, now the interface changed a little bit. There's this new column or this new row in the data table, or it's an SQL instead of a CSV, whatever it is. And so Pipes was in some ways set up to help first think through that workflow and then help manage that workflow, even if it's somewhat manual, to be able to have that sort of outgoing data and incoming data checks in a more formalized approach. In some context, simulation, so like production cost, is helpful across the transmission distribution barrier. Here's one very busy slide, apologize for that, of a co-simulation framework we've been building with a number of other national labs. This is out there and very stable and used for many years on hundreds of projects. That allows us to take existing models, say a PSSE and a Good Lab D if you're doing engineering work, or it could be more of a production cost in a Plexos or Aurora combined with something again like an OpenDSS or some other models of the distribution side, as well as anything else that's relevant, controllers and market models and those pieces can all be assembled together, and time is synchronized and data is exchanged as needed to advance. You can see this particular framework, a lot of tools we've been using already in this past within that wheel on the right. Here's an example from the Puerto Rico 100 project, where we did just as I described, using PSSE connected with OpenDSS via Helix. And this was quite interesting. You can see these two graphs where there's lots of gray pieces. Those are distribution voltages across, randomly selected because there's so many different nodes across multiple feeders, and comparing those to what would have been simulated with a bulk-only model, and the result of things like a fault that caused a bit of a fault-induced delayed voltage recovery from motor stalls and those interactions with distributed resources. And you can see, and simplistically, the transmission simulator wasn't capturing all those nuances as shown in blue on the right, if you did PSSE with lump load models and DERA, and it was relevant to capture so much diversity on the distribution system. So there's an opportunity where co-simulation was used. The other piece is when we start to think about in a more planning context, is there an analog? And the answer is we're working on one called multidisciplinary design analysis optimization for the grid. This is an aerospace idea that is attempting to balance across, the little cartoons in the upper right, where the structures people might want to build an airplane out of I-beams, but the aerodynamics would like to make it all smooth and shiny. So taking a similar approach to transmission distribution and really any integrated energy planning, where multiple models can pass data in an automated framework. So this would be existing models, the ones we already have, coupling together, not with people necessarily, but trying to automate these processes to get at that co-optimization using existing tools. Of course, the hard part is automating the handoffs and the feedbacks. What happens if your distribution simulation shows one thing? How do you update the capacity expansion model? It's something we're working on right now in partnership with NYSERDA. Lots of advantages here. You can trade out the tools and not have to change anything else. You can also do things like, oh wait, that model takes forever to run. Maybe I could use a surrogate model based on data or do some curve fitting on the fly. Anyway, lots of different pieces. Both this co-simulation and co-optimization multi-model frameworks do allow an interesting paradigm where different organizations could be running their models in separate places and sharing the data through the cloud. So that's an opportunity, or not even the cloud, it could through a VPN if you'd prefer. That's an opportunity for thinking about integrated, overcoming some of the challenges of integrated modeling. And so kind of the closing thoughts I have here before we have a few minutes for Q&A, partially a summary. Hey, yeah, this transmission distribution divide is real, and we need to think about how to overcome it well. Listed out a number of different kind of high-level architectures with examples for each for how this might be done. And the argument for having some of the more sophisticated, like number 3 and 4, is the idea that those first ones can miss some of the key interactions or perpetuate assumptions that went in at the beginning. I highlighted already this idea that existing hosting capacity ignores the fact that there's already distribution upgrades and potential value streams associated with those that would be missed, as well as the idea that a once-through workflow where we're, say, taking distribution exogenously and running it through transmission, might miss those opportunities for distribution-sided storage or other resources to provide services to the bulk system, to offset the need for transmission, to get something built faster, whatever the motivation are. The slightly harder to compute, but more interactions that we see in those later iteration or co-optimization, co-simulation can help overcome those. Last few thoughts here are that, hey, all these things need a lot of data. Got that. Distribution tends to be some of the hardest. Highlight the idea that some of the simplified but still multi-node models could offer a sweet spot. Increasing amounts of that data is also available through things like hosting capacity maps, not necessarily the outcomes of those maps, but just the understanding of where things are and where bottlenecks are could help us understand some of the opportunities for T&D interactions. Also mentioned the idea that we could reduce some of the data exchange if you're doing these multi-organizations exchanging just the touch points between models instead of the full models through these modular frameworks. Final piece on other key gaps, the idea of interchangeable interfaces, that if we're getting into a paradigm of more multi-model frameworks, think about how, if for those of you who were around back in the days before USB on computers, it was a bit of a pain to get printers and mouse and keyboards and everything all connected. Then USB came along. Imagine if we had a similar approach available when we start to think about power system and grid and energy system modeling. And then finally, on the data side, we talked about distribution's hard, of course, lots of data for all these resources. But one thing that seems to often be missed, kind of gets squished under the wall, if you will, are these mid-scale, often front of the meter, but still distribution or sub-transmission connected resources, because those tend to not necessarily be on the radar of kind of either of those more extremes. And it's something that I think is important for us to keep an eye on. Anyway, so with that, I think we have a couple minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Brian. Sorry, there are questions from the chat. Oh, okay. Sorry. Let's see. I guess from Peiyuan Chan, what types of systems are suitable for each of the 4 simulation approaches?
Yeah, that's a great question. I stopped sharing so we could take a look, but I'll work on pulling that up while I start talking.
Yeah, if you could pull that back up. Looks like slide 6. And then Peiyuan also asks, what is included in distribution? In Europe, it could still be meshed 130 kV grid. Which of the 4 simulation methods would be more suitable here?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so I'll try to run through both of those. I think that in many larger scale economic analyses, we might find a combination of these 4 different paradigms that are listed, depending on which of the different approaches are being used. I would say that the lower the numbers, we get that once through or co-modeling, those tend to be situations where, particularly in the once through, we're less worried about the distribution scale resources being, if it's an economic situation like a market, being price makers, but more price takers, or you can imagine similar things in terms of energy makers or service makers or other types of approaches. Those types of interactions tend to need to move more towards iteration or co-optimization, since otherwise we're kind of missing those types of dimensions of feedback. I think also value stacking is when we're starting to think about, hey, a certain amount of resources might be adopted by a customer for, hey, just their own economic, offsetting retail rates. But wait, if we were able to participate with an aggregator who's then participating in like a wholesale market or some other type of program that provides an additional value stream, like that's hard to capture if you're doing everything once through. It's much more practical to capture in some of the iterative and or ideally co-optimization spaces. And I think we're really getting into some of those strong trade-offs between, hey, can these resources on a distribution or sub-transmission scale really help offset the needs on the bulk system? There's an opportunity to do some of that through the iterative approaches, but I think there's an opportunity to capture more of those value streams in the more co-optimization and co-simulation space. That comes particularly tricky when you think about value streams that are tricky to capture at a system scale, but very relevant at a distribution scale. One that comes to mind is the resilience benefits of grid forming inverters connected with microgrid controllers. Like those often don't make economic sense from a bulk system, but may make a lot of sense for a local distribution system. And so if we aren't really capturing all those pieces, we may be missing something. If we just think about that example of the microgrids in a once through, we'd only see the situation where that's providing local services. But if that same technology is also able to provide services to the bulk system, then the opportunities for those iterations, like optimizations, could really see things that were on the margins of being built for distribution alone being suddenly valuable. And then second question was really interesting about the scale of what we're talking about with distribution. And of course, it varies a lot. In the States, some definitions are 35 kV and below, or below 35 kV, but that's except if it's a radial, sometimes even 345 kV serving like a large metropolitan area at the end of a line can even be considered distribution. So it does vary a lot. I think a lot of times those higher voltage resources tend to be already included in the bulk planning processes in most regions. So the idea here is trying to capture those resources at lower voltages or other reasons that aren't necessarily already included in the bulk system planning.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Brian. There's a few more questions that have come in, but I think we need to go to the next presenter. So maybe if you want to just type in answers in the Q&A.
Will do. Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much. That was great. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Chris Clack from Pattern Energy, talking about co-optimization across generation, transmission, storage, and distribution. And all right, it came up and then it just went away. Let's see. Great.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you. So what I'm going to try and talk about today is kind of looking at the sort of other end of the scale of trying to look at what we can do at a national level. My experience is primarily with the Wisdom tool. So we're going to just walk through that. I'm going to focus hopefully on how I've been handling distribution and how it impacts the results more than actual many results. The caveat at the beginning, I work for Pattern Energy. These are my opinions, and what I'm talking about here was actually primarily done when I ran a company called Vibrant Clean Energy, and a lot of the results that I'm going to show was actually part of a project that looked at coordinating DERs with the CCSA. We released that study back in 2020, so that's what we're mainly going to be using as sort of images. So if you see the VCE logo or anything like that, it's just because of their legacy images. I just wanted to also put a quick plug in right at the beginning for a resource adequacy renewable energy power data set that we released a few weeks ago at the ESIG workshop in Providence, Rhode Island. It allows you to download county level hourly wind and solar profiles for 5 years at the moment, and then we're going to be releasing another 5 years in Q1 2025. So we have 2014 through 2023. That'll hopefully be the start of having this a unified data set that people can use, open source and available for everyone. So the Wisdom model that I'm talking about, the acronym just means weather informed energy systems. I believe, and have tried to show through my work, that weather is going to shape a lot more of the economy going forward, not just the supply, but also the demand side. And when I think of the economy, I don't just think of electricity, even though that is the primary driver of the way we're going to shift to creating energy. But I think the rest of the economy is going to be connected to the electricity grid in a more holistic way going forward. And what that means is there's more opportunities for weather to creep in, both in a good way and a bad way, in the rest of the economy, which means more of the economy is hinging on understanding how the weather works and how that interacts with the economic system. And what I'm just trying to show here is a cartoon from a paper of the different ways that we can move energy. The top right is showing how energy demands might go up, particularly electricity demands, under different scenarios. And so there's quite a wide range and quite a big uncertainty in how that's going to change. And the bottom right is just showing some of the ways that we could link to other fuel sources or feedstocks or energy carriers across the grid. And the reason I'm showing this is because the model that we built, called Wisdom, was traditionally built for sort of utility scale. and we are trying to put in distribution scale. And as Brian was pointing out, they are very different scales, and so thinking about them together has both positive pieces, but also some difficult pieces that we have to overcome. So just to kind of give some grounding of what Wisdom P is, which is the planning version of the model, we try and combine as much as possible production cost and capacity expansion together. And what I mean by that is we're trying to include as much as we can across a continental scale of things that are in a production cost model. And we're also trying to do capacity expansion as well. And we do that myopically year on year through the long term. And what we've been able to do with some techniques, which I'll go into during this talk, is bring in some distribution planning effects that will change how the solution looks for the utility scale, but keeps the system separate because they're at different scales. And one of the big things that hopefully will come away from this is there's a lot of data involved in this. And Brian also put this of the data is critical for these models. You can have a great model, but if your data going in isn't useful, that's not great. But you can make a reasonable model a lot better if you get much better granular data. So traditionally, when we run this model, we're running at county level, so zonal at county level, and then we have hourly resolution for the weather drivers as well. We could go down to more granular resolution, but that then has a trade-off of solve times. So the core data sets that a lot of people on this call probably know about, but there's traditional utility scale generators that exist across the continent. This is focused, by the way, on the continental US, but this should apply to most of the regions. We have the transmission system. What we try and model down to is the 69 kilovolts. That's where there's quite a lot of data in the US, so it makes it relatively easy. Below that, the data gets a lot sparser depending on where you're looking, and so to get a whole countrywide look becomes very, very difficult, which is why we came up with the method that I'm going to talk about. We have to think about buildable areas, and again, you want that to be as high resolution as possible, and you want to include as much detail as possible. So these are traditional for capacity expansion. The thing that's slightly different in Wisdom is that we're trying to do it at kind of a high resolution spatially from the get-go. We're not trying to make it big bulk zones. We're trying to minimize the discrepancy between the two types of models. Then we have demands, which we'll talk about in a minute, which is a big data hurdle, and then climate change, which I'm not going to talk about too much today, but that's another tier of modeling that typically we put on top of everything else we're doing to see how the grid responds to changes in climate, and that will then drive differences in weather. So I think everyone's seen these maps before, but this is the wind resource map across the US or the continental US. And so when we're thinking about bulk transmission and generation, a lot of people will look at the plains and think that's very windy, so we should put wind turbines there and try and move them to the coast, which is a great way of thinking. The downside to that is not as many people live in the center of the country, and so we've got to think about, do we move the resources closer to those cities and not put as many in the plains. Equally, this is the same thing but for solar, and what we're looking at here is the desert southwest is much more sunny and therefore has higher capacity factors, and so the capacity factor is just essentially the percentage of the year that it's at 100%. So 26% would be 26% of the year. And so what you can see is that we already have to think about moving energy around the country. The country isn't quite set up yet to move the power around long distances, but we can actually vary that when we think about doing generation and transmission, which is why these bulk systems traditionally do the two together now a lot more than they used to. Weather has sort of driven that. One sort of aside that I wanted to mention is that we really want to be using multi-year if possible, because a single year can really throw the results. I'm showing 8 years here, and red means more power than the average and blue means less power than the average, and the range is about 25%. So if you look at the top left and the bottom right, this is for wind. You can see that the swing there is about, well, you can't see it, but the swing is about 40% across the country in terms of power produced between those years. So we have to think about that when we're doing resource adequacy. The model itself is trying to do weather not just on the resource side, but also thinking about how that affects the transmission ratings, the heat rates, and how those actually change what power could be transmitted through it. And so the reason I'm explaining all this beforehand is that this is included in the model before we then put in the distribution. So as we push towards the distribution, what we're adding in the distribution piece when we get to it is looking at how those resources might able to influence sort of a spatially sort of aggregate or disaggregated model, and how that might actually change things with this detailed weather on top. So we're already getting sort of detailed weather included. And this is the last thing I'll talk about climate here, but like how that impacts the weather will then impact the transmission, not just the wind and solar resources, but also the transmission ratings themselves and the heat rates as well. And one of the reasons I'm just talking about this now is because what we found in the study that we did in 2020 was actually the distribution resources, when you co-optimize together, do actually help ameliorate some of the issues that you get with climate change. But I'm not going to delve into that here because I want to really focus more on the transmission. Sorry, the distribution, I beg your pardon. So when we talk about the data, I kind of think about electrification coming in and how that's going to change load growth, essentially. We also have another driver now, which is data centers, but the one that I see being biggest of all to start with is transportation across the country. It's a low-hanging fruit in terms of barrier to entry for customers without massive changes in their lifestyles. But we also then think about space heating and water heating. And when you bring the electrification in, the reason we need to start thinking about distribution is that a lot of these assets will be added in the distribution grid. And when I talk about distribution, I'm talking anything below 69 kilovolts. But really what I'm thinking about is customers that are plugging in their EVs, or they're putting an air source heat pump in, or a ground source heat pump, or an air source water heater, and how we may be able to use that along with some distribution assets to actually drive down the need for other assets on the utility grid itself. And so this image is just showing like the rise is coming, we think, although the range again is pretty varied. When we sort of look really far out, the reason it scares me that we need to have distribution planning and we need to really put the effort in to do it, which I hope a lot of people can see by the end of these talks, is that we're going to have a completely different system in less than 30 years if electrification does come to fruition. Even if electrification isn't there, the supply is going to change quite dramatically, which makes it more volatile, the supply itself. But all I'm trying to show here is that basically when we model this out to 2050, if we put electrification in, essentially all load is above today's historical peaks. And we see some really big spikes happening when we electrify. And that's both because we've got supply coming in, but the main reason is that we have these really difficult periods where we're either heating houses when they're cold, or we don't have the battery storage to minimize these peaks. And these are very large peaks. The reason I circled the one on the right here on the image is actually when we do the modeling, we found that the peak on the left in January and February wasn't the most stressed period. It was actually the one on the right, and hopefully we'll be able to illustrate that. So as Bryan really pointed out, like a lot of this work ends up being data and data engineering and data mining. So I'm just going to show an example here of turning energy, i.e. space heating, water heating, as well as air conditioning, into a usable input into our model. So we have to look at, and we've aggregated to state level here, but again, this was done at county level. We've got to look at what the building stock is, if we can get good data on that, the age of the building stock. Can we get composite like data on what the building materials are? What percentage are using natural gas versus electricity? And then try and aggregate that together for our purposes into a county level. And what we're trying to show here is that like every state has different resources when you aggregate up to the state. You have different amounts using natural gas versus electricity. The housing sizes are very different. And then we have on the middle bottom is a distribution that one of my former colleagues did of like the heat loss that's happening, or the total heat that's being used by the houses to keep them warm in this instance. And then the bottom right is showing heat losses. And this comes to Brian's point of we've had to do pre-processing of making assumptions of these building stocks that can obviously change over time, and use that as a proxy for what we think will then grow over time into the future. And so there's a lot of assumptions that go in. And so why I'm saying the details matter here is that the assumptions that we add in need to be checked and validated, and that becomes a lot of work in itself too. So when that's all said and done, what we end up with is profiles that are related to the weather. So each weather year has its own profiles. And again, I'm showing two states here just to show the differences between them. The top left is showing the space heating between California and Minnesota. And so this is the fractional energy use. So these sum to 1 over the year on the top left and the bottom left. And what that does is that then multiplies by the annual demands. And then that gives us a shape. Equally as important is on the right, which is our flexibility profiles. So these are the profiles that the model sees as being able to flex. And so what we've had to do here for those assumptions is give an approximate size of the asset fleet in each county, and how much of that can be flexed in each hour without ruining the comfort of the occupants of the buildings. So again, we have to give assumptions about what range is comfortable, whether people would allow it to be used. And what you'll see is in California, for example, on the top right, there actually is no heating flexibility in summer because it's too hot to then add heat to the building. So that's what the heating flexibility is. And the air conditioning is kind of the inverse of that. And so what it's saying is how much of those assets can be used in that hour to actually move the demand about. And then if we're using DSM, you have to pay this energy back, and you have to have some constraints on how long it takes to pay that back. And I'm really just trying to drive home the point is that you have to make assumptions on this, because this is looking at future states, and every assumption you make, you have to think about, is it a real assumption or is it an artifact of the modeling? And this is layered on top of the physics of the weather. So the traditional wisdom model looks at basically what Brian was talking about, the one-way flow, which is essentially we have distribution resources, and so everything that I've just talked about up until this point exists in the model up and throughout. The difference is that there was no interface between the distribution scale and the utility scale. And so what that meant was there was no reason for the model to see any benefit other than to shape demand a little bit, to actually building these entities in the distribution grid versus utility scale. It will use some DSM to do load shedding, or to peak shaving rather, and it will build some distributed solar, but it's not going to see any cost of backflow, and it's not going to see any benefit of being closer to the demand. And so this is an example output for a county in the US, and I'm showing this deliberately to kind of show the difference between the distribution and the utility. On the left is utility. That's kind of the supply side in this paradigm. And on the right is the distribution, and I'm calling it demand, but there is some distribution assets that can be used. And what we're seeing here is the black lines in both should relate to each other, apart from losses that are added on. But hopefully what we can see here is on the right, you can see the duck curve being created by the solar PV being built in the distribution grid. And what we're also seeing on the utility grid is we are seeing storage being built. We are seeing generators working together to meet the demand. This is a 2040 timeframe, by the way, as well. And what we're also seeing is that in the utility grid, we're seeing solar, which is red, wind, which is green, and storage being used. And in brown here is actually imports from another county. So the transmission is moving around. So this is what you will traditionally see with a normal model. Sometimes they put exogenous DPV into modeling, and other times it'll be endogenous. Here it's endogenous. The main thing that we did here, I'm not going to go into the maths of it, but essentially we created an interface between the distribution grid and the utility grid. You can think of it as a bit of a wheeling charge to pay for the infrastructure that's being created. It will count the cost of making load be met, energy and power, and also then the backflow costs of having the feeders and distribution infrastructure send power back into the transmission grid. What this allows the model to do is separate the two systems essentially across that interface, and allows the model to understand there's a cost of building the infrastructure in the distribution grid. So when we do that, what we see is a very changed grid. So this is the exact same county with the exact same data, apart from that interface going in. And hopefully, the first thing that should point out is on the right-hand side, there's a lot more going on in the distribution grid. And the load looks a lot flatter, as in there's a much higher floor to the distribution demand. And there's not much sign of a duck curve going on in these two. And on the left, what you see is a different resource mix supplying power as well. If we zoom into the distribution portion here quickly, what you can see is that essentially there's solar and storage essentially doing most of the work. There is DSM charging. This is a small county where there isn't a huge amount. But we see basically the storage charging, taking away the solar DPV in the day to get rid of the duck curve, and then discharging to reduce the peaks later in the day. What it is also doing is shifting demand to when there's more supply, typically renewable supply on the utility grid, where it can actually absorb more power as well, and shift power around for that. When we look at this in a direct comparison, the top is without the distribution co-optimization and the bottom is with. Hopefully it's a starker contrast, particularly when you look at the right, of how the distribution has changed when we have that interface being put into the model. It really does change how the model is thinking, even with this relatively simplistic way of looking at it. And the reason it can be simplistic is we have all that detail spatially and granularly across the model already, and then we add in this this interface essentially. It does the same thing in summer. The top again is without the distribution co-optimization, and the bottom is with it. What it's doing essentially in summer is actually flattening the peaks pretty strongly, and then bringing up the floor a bit. And hopefully what you can see between the left and the right at the bottom is that you can see the losses coming in of where it's moving the power around the county to get these resources shared. It doesn't get rid of all the variability, but it gets it managed more appropriately for the model to be able to utilize more resources efficiently. What this does, when you sort of zoom out a little bit, for this particular county, is what we're seeing is I've got these red and blue arrows. The x-axis is the original demand before the models run, and the y-axis is the demand after the DER, or the distribution coordination co-optimization, is happening. And you'll see these long, thin lines at the top right and the bottom left. That is essentially the extremes that the model is seeing, and it's essentially removing those entirely. And so the red arrow is the dynamic range that there was in the original demand that it's trying to meet, and then the blue is what the new demand is doing. So it's trying to use the grid more efficiently between distribution and utility. We kind of look at that as a load duration curve. What I'm trying to show here is, again, this red is what's been shaved off essentially by using resources in the distribution grid. The yellow on the right hand side there is actually what's been increased. And so now you can see those blue and red arrows looking at how the dynamic range has been shrunk. This kind of hides some of the detail of how it's shifting the demand as well to meet supply, which helps the utility side actually produce power more efficiently. So now I'm sort of zooming out to the CONUS level to kind of see how that all sort of mashes together. So at the CONUS level, it looks a lot smoother. The left is the utility grid, the right is the distribution grid, and these are all aggregated together, so you get a lot of data destruction, if you will, or averaging out, because not everything's coincident. But you do see a shrinking of the peak power as well as a rising of the floor. And again, this kind of totally eliminates the duct curve across the nation generally, and you get a much flatter power need. This is swinging back to that piece that I showed about the November time period where we had a real difficult time, or the model had a difficult time solving. And what we find is you get a bit of quite a bit of curtailment around it. But if you look in the center of this image, there's 5 or 6 days where there's not much curtailment. It's using a lot of storage, and it's able to do that because it's actually shrinking down the demand on the distribution side to actually remove some of the difficulties, and it's really helped ride through this period. And so from our stress metric, it actually reduced it by 10 percentage points, which I'll happily go into with people afterwards. Last few slides here, really like zooming out of like, what does this all mean in terms of how does it change the grid sort of at a macro level? And so on the left, I'm just showing 4 scenarios through time. The far left one is the BAU of each stack. And what we're essentially seeing is more utility scale wind and solar, essentially, more distributed solar as well, and a lot more distributed storage. A lot more storage gets shifted into the distribution grid. So we do see a big shift of storage from what we see as the utility grid into the distribution grid. And if we had more flexible demands, I think that would shrink. But that's the big change we're seeing. The generation stacks themselves, again, not a huge amount of information here other than we are seeing an increase in renewables in general, both on the utility side as well as on the distribution side. And it reduces the amount of gas over time as well. How does this affect costs? So this is a difficult one when we think about the costs because, like I said, there's a lot of assumptions baked in. We use publicly available data for the distribution infrastructure costs on a state-by-state basis. It was a UT study from a while back now. But if we have more data, we can include more data. And what I'm showing on these two is like, top left is when we add the BAU with the distribution. The white bars there are the change in retail costs. So it's negative all the way through 20 cents per megawatt. 20 cents it should say per megawatt hour, not per kilowatt hour. And on the right, we're showing the same thing, but against a clean energy mix. So with the BAU, what we're seeing is a big saving on the distribution side because we're doing these upgrades, but we're doing them efficiently, and we're not having to build out huge distribution for renewables coming online and small scale electrification coming online. For the clean energy, what we're seeing is a diminishment of actual coal and gas with some reduction in the distribution side. So how does this all like fill out over time? So this is the cumulative changes. If we just have the coordination in the modeling, we're looking at 150 billion cumulatively by 2050. If we do that with clean energy mandates, we're looking at 500 billion possibly. The alternative way of saying that is that we've got 500 billion wiggle room of error in the model by 2050 that we could spend that much more and still get the same result while coordinating with distribution. And then the big one for me is the electrification dwarfs everything. If this blue line is when we have electrification included, we're looking at 4.5 trillion by 2050 in savings because we're forcing so much more electrification of the distribution grid. If we don't invest in that in a way that is efficient and coordinated, we could see a lot of money being left on the table and a lot of opportunity cost there as well. And this final slide is just to allow us if there's time for questions, but to show the model running over a time period. The bottom right is showing the dispatch stack, and then the images on the screen are showing sort of state-to-state transmission, as well as the colors are telling us the biggest resource. So brown is if it's load, and then green is wind, red is solar, blue is hydro. And so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Chris. That was really fascinating. There's a question from Thomas Lee. Does Wisdom use the WEC EI planning network model? How do you model the distribution of nodal demand profiles at 69 kV, for example?
So we've built all our data at the moment from open source. We're starting to integrate with our work at Pattern, the WEC model. We do everything at county level at the moment, so we don't have a nodal version for this. We aggregate together at the county level. When we go down to nodal, we have to kind of rethink how we're doing it because there's just so much more data. We have to think about trade-offs with solve time.
Great, thank you so much. I guess, maybe you could just explain a little more about the importance of capturing the distribution interface. For example, for folks who, most of us running capacity expansion models aren't capturing the distribution upgrade costs, right? So what we're going to see when we look at your answer is that you're pushing a lot of the PV and the storage down to the distribution level, and it's making the whole overall system more expensive. I guess if you could just speak a little bit more to why it's so important to capture that and what it is that we're not getting when we do our traditional capacity expansion modeling.
Yeah, so basically, so when we're moving the storage and moving more distributed PV into the distribution, of course, the capital costs of those are much more expensive than the utility side. But we're actually getting a benefit by not building stuff on the utility side. So there's a net increase in cost. But then we're thinking about the distribution interface, like the infrastructure, the wires, essentially the feeders, the substations that are having to deal with all that power that would be pushing in. If we're building more load, which is what we see happening, you can offset some of that increase in cost. But then you can also plan ahead and use the distribution infrastructure to actually pass the power back to the transmission system. And so when you net out all those different costs, you end up with a slight cost benefit. Because you've added that additional cost, the models can see that actually there's a cost of moving my utility power into a distribution grid and into load. Whereas traditionally, right now, you don't see that cost. You just see the cost being zero, essentially. And so there is no benefit of it because you're just paying more costs for things in the distribution grid without the model being able to recognize that actually that might offset other costs elsewhere. And when we did the modeling, this was over hundreds of scenarios, we found that most often it's cheaper to do that across the nation. There are some places where it's more expensive, but that's with minimal coordination. We're deliberately separating these grids in the sense of there is coordination across the interface, but we're not doing sort of resource aggregation or smart DERMS and things like that within the distribution itself.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Chris. We're now going to move on to the next presenter. It's Luke Falla from the Australian Energy Market Operator. He's going to be talking about AEMO's Integrated System Plan. And he's joined us very early from Australia.
Debbie. So I'll talk about our integrated system plan. So this is the plan we have for Australia looking ahead. So it's similar in many other of these planning studies looking at capacity expansion models and transmission expansion. And we're also having the same questions about how to include the distribution. Not being from the US, I thought I'd have a bit of a background really first about who we are and what we do and what our system integration plan really is, and then talk through what we do, how we do it, and talk about some of the features for coming up into the future. So really, AEMO, we don't actually own any assets or we don't sign off on upgrades, but we're oversee the planning process for the eastern states of Australia. So on the eastern side of Australia, you have a number of separate states who have their own asset owners and planners, but whereas we try to oversee the whole eastern side to ensure coordination of planning across the states. We also operate the retail and household gas as a separate function, and we also look at Western Australia, but that's a totally separate network, not covered by our integrated system plan. So really, we started out as operating the energy system for Australia. So that's real-time control rooms and monitoring reviews, engineering analysis, things like that. So because there was separate states with interconnection, that we were seen as as an overview of all these electricity networks and operate them to get the market operating between the all different states. And so recently we've had a new function, so from about 2018, this has been increased a bit, which is more the energy forecasting, modeling and planning to try improve the planning processes and speed up and coordinate for the energy transition going ahead. So I'll talk about our recently published 2024 integrated system plan, where we try integrate some of these transmission, generation and distribution factors, and talk about what we've done, how we've done it, and some of the limits that we see. So what it really is, it's meant to be a roadmap for our national electricity market. So we have a 5-state electricity system, the market, which actually has the 5 nodes, is not a full nodal, but it's just a 5-state. So we have 5 different prices across the market. We're trying to find an optimal development path to reaching net zero by 2050. So a lot of our existing baseload is coal, which is we're looking to certainly phase out as we get to 2050. So we're looking at really how to get this large amount of renewables into the system, as well as retiring generation at the same time. As you say, we don't actually approve the transmission or the generation builds, but what it says, it gives a plan. It gives input into the governments and into their policies, and also as part of the increased regulatory purposes, we are looking at speeding up the existing regulatory processes. So the integrated system plan really is taken over one of the first steps of our usual regular investment test. So normally each state will have to do their own regular investment test, which is quite a lengthy process, whereas at least this provides the first step in that, and provides the market modeling and the other assumptions that go into these regular investment tests to help speed up the future investments. So this is a bit of an output from our model. So this is traditionally what you see from a capacity expansion model. You can see where we are, and really historically we've relied on black and brown coal. And as you look into the future, we see an awful lot of solar, wind storage going to be needed to replace that capacity, as well as replacing that retiring generation. It's also about the electrification and meeting the increased load. So part of our modeling, we don't just rely on the advised retirement dates of some of this coal generation. We do look ahead and see, well, when's it likely that it's not going to be economic for this plant to run. So we try to forecast that as well. What we can see in these results, we talk about rooftop solar and other distributed solar forming a large part of the system into the future. So for these results, that wasn't an optimized outcome. That was an input radius from a forecast. So that was one of the limitations really from the way we're doing the modeling, and we'll talk through why that's at the moment. Whereas there's also a lot of distributed storage within the model, which we do allow to operate as storage, as with a coordinated type of system. And at the same time as trying to do a generation capacity expansion model, we also co-optimize with the transmission network builds. And what we're seeing is there's a lot of transmission going to be needed to transport the energy around Australia. So quite a large landmass and a lot of diversity between the different areas. So you have areas which are like South Australia, which are already reaching over 100% penetration of rooftop and utility solar to supply the entire demand of that state at the moment. You have areas like Tasmania who can be run by 100% renewables already, and then you have areas like Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland, which are predominantly run by coal, and so their baseload is disappearing. So we're certainly seeing a lot of transmission requirement to bring these states together to share their resources as the transition occurs. So we really split the transmission needs up into about three stages, or 3 timeframes. We include the committed and anticipated. So these are projects which have undergone a regulatory investment test, which means that they have gone through a much more rigorous technical review and signed off by the regulator. So we include that as a base in our model. And then one of the outputs from our system integration plan is saying what is actionable. So what we mean by that is what projects need to be started straight away as a regular investment test to progress through to being built. And that's really one of the key outputs for us is to really say, what's the next plan? We need to look at how long it's going to take to actually build. Let's start right away. Whereas some of the other future ISB projects, we kind of identify these as later on in the horizon, saying, well, we can study these a bit further in the future. But there's actionable ones, which really are the crucial ones for our integrated system plan. Okay, I'll talk about really our modeling, which allows us to come up with these type of results. So we have a traditional generation expansion model, which we're really pushing quite hard. Starts off with a single stage long-term model, which really is just a linear expansion, which linear for the transmission and the generation. We try to look at gas and gas constraints, simplified hydro representation. This is really to give us a bit of a starting point about where we start to then iterate on this detailed long-term model. So the detailed long-term model is, again, it's a linear expansion, but with a bit more detail, a bit more fidelity in all the traces and the load modeling. But what we really use with this detailed model is, even though it's a linear expansion, to get the transmission timings and projects, we do a lot of sequences of transmission as full upgrades. We will run the DLT each time with a transmission in place as a full upgrade. How does that impact all the capacity for the transmission? How does that then impact on the economics? And so we'll do that for each transmission upgrade, for check different timings, all the different sequences or combinations. So we end up doing thousands of runs in the DLT model, which really does take up a lot of our modeling time. Because we're aware of the limitations of the limited representation, maybe of some of the time frames, the shorter time blocks within a a daily model. We also do the checks on what we call the time sequential model. So that's more of a traditional market model, which doesn't optimize to build generation or transmission, but it just runs the market as this. It's a bit of a Monte Carlo method where we allow the outages, we check the reliability, confirm that all the constraints and other network limits that we assumed in the DLT do work out, and then we'll iterate back if we find any more reliability issues or issues like that. And as we're aware that the time sequential model, again, is just a simplified representation of the network, the full network model. We will bring that market modeling into a full load flow, like network analysis snapshots, to again check that things like peak demand days, high VRE, maximum interconnected flow periods, that these do line up within the market model, and then iterate back to tune the model a few times to make sure that our output is robust. So network analysis is not always just load flows. We sometimes will have limits such as system strength, what we call system strength. So that's the need to meet fault current requirements for all the VRE and other issues like that. So we do look forward with that. So there's some proxies used in fault circuit analysis or inertia studies as well. I think there's things like that. So we try to have a whole representation of the system as a secure system that can be operated into the future. So this is really an overview of how it all links together within our model. So you have all the gas market, which really supplies the gas. We don't really try to predict the gas network itself or options for the gas network, but we do look at certainly the gas capacity, and is it realistic for the generation that we're saying is needed into the future. We've got the generation and retirement expansion, the transmission network expansion. Yeah, so this is really an overview of how it all works together and how all the different tools and assessments are linked in our studies. So one of the issues we do have really is trying to get all this detail into a model which can run and do those thousands of iterations in the DLT within a time frame we can actually get results and report on. So we do have to separate or simplify our network into where we see there are limitations. So rather than have a full load flow representation of our network, it's divided into regions and subregions, and where the subregional splits are is where we see network limits and where we see network upgrades are likely to be required. And so we run our capacity expansion on this limited network representation. So each interface will have seasonal limits. Each subregion will have generation planting. It'll have storage requirements. It'll have all the DR and all that aspects for all these items. And then we will, in the DLT, that's where we will look at the sub-regional limits, and we'll increase certain interconnected or other transmission limits one at a time, and look at sequencing and retirements and all the different areas. And that's the basis of that DLT, really. And the reason we have to do this is just really for the runtime, trying to get all those thousands of iterations and get an outcome, looking at those sensitivities, different scenarios, and all those aspects that we need to do to come up with a robust plan. So the other aspect of the modeling, which is maybe not from from our historical generation capacity modeling, where we've changed, is how we look at renewable energy zones. So these we have had a process where we identified all the resources within all different states, whether it's a solar resource or a wind resource. So these have been mapped. We have all the hourly traces years ahead, looking at all the diversity and the resource quality for each of these areas. And we map this almost similar in a way to what we have a generator model, but we have the cost for the generation to be built. We have all the limits for the land use limits for how much generation we can actually get within these renewable energy zones. We have some offshore ones now as well. So look at the ocean depth to see what's floating, what's fixed. And so in order to capture the cost of accessing that generation, some of these remote areas, we have a linear network expansion cost really for the res limit modeling. So rather than trying to iterate on all the additional transmission expansion requirements for renewable energy zones, we'll have it just as a linear expansion, and later on resolve that in time sequential modeling as to whole projects. If we see that these network projects are likely to occur in the timeframes where they'll be actionable, we will then bring it into that discrete project. So we will then look at a whole transmission upgrade rather than these piecemeal linear expansions for the reses. This is a bit of an example of what the process we go through. We look at all these renewable energy zones, look at all the transmission options that we can bring get it into that sub-region to expand the model. So because we model what we call a transmission limit for the renewable generation, we don't really call it a hosting capacity. We actually say there's a transmission limit. So what this allows us to do is to put resources such as wind and solar into a renewable energy zone and capture that diversity between the two resources. And it also allows the model to assess the economics of a curtailment of that generation if needed. So we typically find, you can get a lot of wind and solar together, really increase the utilization of the network, and anything 3 to 4% curtailment of that generation as well before looking to need to upgrade the networks. The reason we're doing that, the linear expansion modeling, is again for the runtime on these aspects. So I think, as everyone's talked about before, there's a lot of data, and this takes up a lot of our processes. Really, is that consulting and developing these inputs. So a bit of a busy slide, but this is all the typical inputs that we put into our processes. So one of the interesting ones that we have really is the transmission costing. I suppose we've had to develop a process where we do the costing ourselves. We find all the different states or different stakeholders might have different methods or different assumptions going into costing. So we have an online or published transmission cost database, which then we build up all our network options using that and publish all the inputs and assumptions. All this data is published on our website. It goes through a very lengthy consultation process. Often get a lot of consultants developing the data for us. But yeah, I guess a lot of it would be pretty typical for the capacity expansion model that we a lot of other people do as well. And this is a typical time frame, so that for the next ISP coming in 2026, it is a 2-year process for us, and half the time really is about the methodology, consulting on the inputs, consulting on the draft results, and we do get an awful lot of engagement by different stakeholders. So it's certainly a useful process because of that aspect where we're not a asset owner, or we don't sign off on transmission or generation builds. It's one of the reasons we really have to consult quite widely on that. We don't have a lot of good data ourselves from commercial data, so this is something that we do find quite useful. We have a lot of independent reviews, such as the Australian Energy Regulator, and we have consumer panels and other aspects like that. One of the items we are looking to improve for the next ISP, the 2026 ISP, is this question of how do you get distribution costs into the model. Because the way we've done it really is just assuming or forecasting how much distributed energy resources are going to be in the system, building that into the load forecast, looking at sensitivities of those aspects. Whereas now we are looking at, can we do something similar to the way we've done these renewable energy builds, where we have areas of resources, the cost to unlock them, the cost curves developed with a distribution network to allow that resource to be used. And that's something we're currently consulting on and discussing with all the distribution network owners, best way to do that. So yeah, I think a 2026 ISP will be a much more of a generation, transmission and distribution amalgamated outcome. So thank you everyone for listening. Is there a few links for anyone that's interested in more all the data or the methodology that we used? Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Luke. That's a really impressive amount of work for this study. There are a few questions in the Q&A here. Thomas Lee asks a general math question. For transmission planning, upgrading lines also impacts the impedance matrix. So that's the power flows and shift factors, as well as resistances, that's the line losses. This results in a nonlinear model rather than a linear program. What are successful approaches to address this?
That's right. So when we have our subregions and those interconnector paths, when we pre-calculate what the limits are and the flows are, and when we apply an upgrade, a lot of the time it won't be a single number. We will actually put maybe a constraint in there where we have aspects where it's not as radial or it is more mesh. So we'll have distribution factors in the constraints which represent the change, some of those, and that's part of the reason why we have to do one in, one out type studies where you put transmission in. What's the impact on the economics of the system that when we do that, rather than trying to have the model try and optimize all these augmentations at once. So it is a manual process. That's why we have so many iterations trying to get those aspects correct.
Oh, okay. And Vindra Kanai asks, how do you do the hundreds to thousands of power flow simulations for your models? What kind of framework in terms of software and the workflow and the automation and the reporting do you have to use to achieve that?
So it depends on the study, I guess. So we use a lot of the mock modeling is done on a cloud-based system, so that really can push it out and get a lot of results done at once, which results in a lot of data. And so we use like a Databricks back end to be able to extract all that data, and we use that then to feed into load flow models. So we actually get the market modeling outcomes and then build load flows on those outcomes, which is a very difficult process when you're looking 20, 30 years ahead, and a large load increases, and the modeling you've got doesn't really cater for that. So yeah, we don't have a system which would just get any load flow and run automatically. So we do tend to really look for specific conditions, you know, the peak load conditions, the high interconnector flow conditions, the maximum VRE conditions, and we look over those times. So we look at times when we think the network upgrade is going to occur, and we'll extract snapshots from doing that, purposes like that. Items such as where we look at system strength or other security services, those can be a bit easy where they don't need to solve load flow, they just need a network impedance really in the background. And we can iterate over those quite quickly, and we do just do scans, and we can build along duration curves from the results using those methods.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Radhika Donaldson asks, how is storage being thought of in these studies? Do you build storage for transmission needs as well?
Yep, so generation, storage, and transmission is all co-optimized or all assessed to each other. So that's right. Currently, the storage is placed at these sub-regional basis, which is something we're trying to improve because we want to actually extend it down almost to a renewable energy zone basis to try see the impact on that side of things. And that's something, again, 2026 RSP we're looking to push more. But we find the storage is one of the aspects it really does increase the runtime, so it's quite difficult. And we do include storage in the distribution side. We assume a certain amount of coordinated storage within the distribution when these models are run as well.
Okay. What is the approach used for developing a network expansion cost by zone? And are these values used as input in the long-term studies?
Yep, so we look at, so the major sub-regional upgrades, they are a full cost, a full cost estimate built for those. But for the renewable energy zones where you have a linear expansion cost, really we do look at previous results first of all and say, well, what is the most likely network upgrade? Because we build cost estimates for 3 or 4 options, and we always end up praying the problem, which is the options going to get built? If the model is a linear expansion, does it build half the option? What does that mean? So we do sometimes iterate a few times to get the right option and the right cost, because that is a difficult one when you have a linear expansion for a network upgrade. How do you fit that back into an actual network option in the long term?
Mm-hmm. And Julie Jen asks, is convergence an issue for the load flow cases? How long did it take to solve them?
Yeah, it is a big issue, and that's why we end up doing snapshots, because we need to go through those one at a time, see why it's not solving, because all the time it's voltage stability issues, because you're looking 20 years ahead and the load is much larger and you haven't built out the distribution network or your voltage planning. So yeah, so that is a difficulty for us. So that's why we are we try methods like optimal power flows and fictitious SVCs and part of the network to try represent that voltage stability aspects going forward. But yeah, it does slow us down from being able to just automate getting hundreds of load flows out for all these future systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Vindra Kanai asks, how did you go about building the transmission costing model for kilometer by voltage or by region or by circuit type?
We build our cost estimates from the project specifications. So all the way down from the single line diagrams to the number of circuit breakers, the land. So we have a very detailed cost database for all the transmission. So we will build the actual option within our cost database and have a fairly robust estimate. So we don't do it on a per voltage or a per kilometer or anything like that. It is for the renewable energy zone where we have the linear expansion. It's on how many megawatts per $1 million. Really, that's the type of metric we have for those ones. But we build each actual transmission upgrade option into our full transmission cost estimate.
Great. Well, thank you so much for really impressive study, and a lot of people are really quite interested in your work. I'd now like to turn it over to Dr. Schuyler Matteson from the New York Department of Public Service, who's going to talk about New York's coordinated grid planning process.
Debbie, can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can hear you fine and see you fine.
Excellent. Thanks for having me, everybody. Today I'm here to talk about New York's coordinated grid planning process. My name is Schuyler Matteson. I'm the Clean Energy Planning Lead for New York State at the Department of Public Service. We've just launched a new process starting last year after years of development that I'll get to it into a second. That's supposed to be kind of the one planning process to rule them all in New York State. And I want to kind of walk you through some of the most important pieces of that process. And hopefully we can make some connections today, and folks with better ideas than what we're doing so far can give us a lot of good pointers for what we might be able to do better in the future. So where this all started is back in 2019, we passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act in New York State through the legislature, signed by the governor, saying we have 100% zero carbon electricity by 2040. So that's in state law. Shortly after that, and in response to a lot of the initial studies, the legislature passed the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act that said, you know, a big issue in all of these renewables studies and getting to zero carbon is going to be interconnecting all of that energy and load growth and trying to figure out the T&D upgrades that are necessary. So the act directed the commission to launch a proceeding to get the joint utilities, that's the 6 different utilities in New York State, to run a planning process to identify all the grid needs that might arise between now and 2040 to enable that zero carbon electricity system by 2040. So that was a big ask to try to get all of it, you know, 20 years, long-term planning, best guesses of the generation, transmission, and distribution needs for New York State. But that's what we set out to do in 2020, was to design that process. And I put a link here at the bottom that goes through all of the orders, the filings, the reports, the studies. Every result we've posted to date is going to be found at that link. So if anything I say today sounds interesting, you can find it there, or just shoot me an email and we can connect you with some of that information. So the important thing about this process is that it goes all the way top to bottom for the state. It's supposed to look at everything, bulk interfaces, and the picture on the left there is the New York State bulk transmission network. Our wholesale market is broken into 11 separate zones, roughly based on utility territories before we went integrated into New York ISO. We're a little bit unique in New York State because while we are a single state ISO and a single state regulatory authority, we still have a FERC regulated entity that is outside of the Public Service Commission's jurisdiction. And so there's a little bit of engagement and a lot of coordination needed between us as the regulator, the utilities as the kind of local T&D planners, and the New York ISO, who's the bulk system planner and dispatcher. So that kind of adds a couple extra layers of coordination that makes this process really interesting. On the right side, you'll see all the different utility territories. We have 6 different utilities, but somewhere around 37-ish different local transmission areas. They're all interconnected in various ways. We have a lot of old lines, some of the oldest power lines in the world, actually, in New York State, and many of them have not been touched for a very long time. And so that's one of the unique parts of our process, is trying to figure out how to not just build out a system of the future, but also to bring our current system into the present most cost effectively. So the process that we came up with to design this whole system from the ground up, basically out till 2040, is called the Coordinated Grid Planning Process. The process starts with the designation of an Energy Policy Planning Advisory Council. We call it the EPAC, where the Department of Public Service accepts applications for a wide variety of stakeholders from utilities, the NISO, transmission developers, industry groups, renewable groups, developers, environmental justice organizations. And we formed this council that meets on a regular basis at the beginning of the process to determine data inputs, scenario assumptions, sensitivities, and all the pieces of the process, and what we really need to test to make sure we're getting a full picture of what's really important and the important pieces of the energy transition in New York State. So that kind of kicks the cycle off. The cycle in general is meant to be about a 3-year cycle. We've explored trying to make that slower. Trying to shorten that, make it actually faster than that 3-year cycle. It's a little bit slower than we were hoping at the moment. The issues we're running into is that with all the stakeholder coordination, the many different entities we have to coordinate, trying to be very open and transparent and giving people time to comment on each piece of the process. And there's not really many places that we have found to really shorten that process. So it's going to be tough to make it less than 3 years, but we're trying to find all of our efficiencies that we can. There's been a lot of learnings in this first stage of the process. The stages of this work, we basically broke the coordinated grid planning process into 6 unique stages that all have separate pieces that kind of move sequentially. So stage 1 is the most important, where we're spending a lot of time collecting data, developing capacity expansion model design and inputs, where we've selected 3 primary scenarios to put through the capacity expansion. That's not including all the sensitivities we run on those scenarios, but there's 3 prime scenarios that are going through the capacity expansion model, and will then have their results picked up and put into the nodal power flow and short circuit models that the utilities will be running. Then we go through local area studies to identify issues, solutions development on the distribution and transmission side of things, scrutinize those solutions, make sure there's not any weird interactions, because like I said, there's 6 different utilities. So we have this one capacity expansion planning model that we then hand them the results, and they have to disaggregate it into their territories, find the solutions, sum them back up, and make sure there's not any weird interactions between the territories that are causing inefficiencies. If there are inefficiencies, try to coordinate between the territories to make sure we're having the optimal solutions. And then once they have those optimal solutions designed, we run that all back through capacity expansion model and production cost models to make sure we've seen improvements, the things that we expected to happen are happening, we're minimizing curtailment and cost, and it's a reliable, dispatchable system. And stage 6, importantly, is the report that discusses all of the process, all the results, everything that happened, and recommends the projects that should be funded to enable all of that, those good solutions that we just designed in stages 1 through 5. That process is expected to conclude at the end of 2025 or early 2026, where a report would be drafted by the utilities and submitted to the Public Service Commission here in New York State, likely in the billions of dollars of transmission and distribution upgrades to enable these things. And the commission will identify which of those solutions is worth funding. And an important part of the decision making here is that scenario development. We've tried to design a low transmission, or likely low transmission need scenario, a base case, and a high potential transmission need scenario to kind of bound the analysis, because we are going out 20 years and we want to see that, no matter what do we really need? What are the no regret solutions? Like in every scenario, these solutions are necessary, but these other ones are only necessary in certain scenarios. So we're trying to run those types of scenarios and sensitivities to make sure we're bounding that assessment so that the commission can only kind of approve funding in the next couple years for the things we definitely need in all of those scenarios very, very soon. The rest of this stuff might be able to wait a few years. We're trying to look out as long as we can to give ourselves a runway and to give ourselves the time to do this very long development of new transmission projects. But we've been fairly successful so far. We had a brief, kind of initial phase of this planning before the real planning process kicked off that resulted in a number of successful projects that are already under development. This where we are right now in the coordinated grid planning process is still in this stage 1. It took a very long time to develop all those scenarios and get all the data. And I'm going to go through that in a little more detail here in the next few slides. But we've learned a lot so far, and I'll kind of go through those learnings here in a second. So in our capacity expansion modeling, we've definitely looked at this as the most important part of the process. It is really what determines the generation and resource mix and the likely grid needs. The capacity expansion model that we've designed is not really showing the specific grid needs or the problems on the grid. It's not showing us congestion. It's not showing us overloads, but it is based on the inputs we've seeded the model with. It is showing where less efficient resource allocations are being selected, or increased load or generation in a certain zone is happening. So it's giving us an idea of where issues might be arising, so we can run sensitivities and then make decisions on what goes into production cost modeling and power flow modeling. We're really looking at trying to build the most realistic capacity expansion model we can. always erring on the side of more constraints, especially on the cost and performance and load side of things, because we really want to minimize that post-processing that we have to do. We're trying to run a very open and transparent process, and we know these results as soon as we get them. They are kind of the high-level results that most people are going to cite. How many gigawatts of solar? How many megawatts of wind in what years? What's the cost of all these things? People are going to look at that the most, and so we want to make sure that most of the information that's out there is as accurate as possible and can really be translated one-to-one right into the next stages of the modeling. We're using Plexos in this cycle of the CGPP, and the New York ISO is actually running this capacity expansion model. They have an economic planning department that already had a New York State model of Plexos and the capacity expansion model built up. And so it was easy and a little bit more efficient for us to use them in this cycle. As I said, these inputs extremely important. It's very difficult to find all this modeling, and it starts right at the very top with the load forecast. It's extremely uncertain, and in New York State we have a number of things that are making it very difficult to plan a load forecast. We have extremely high electrification. We have unprecedented load growth due to economic development. We have population and demographic changes. So there's any number of issues that even by itself would make it difficult to forecast these loads, but we have all of them happening kind of at the same time, while we're also having lots of distribution and energy efficiency upgrades. So it's a lot of things to juggle. We kind of lucked out though, because the state has, as part of the Climate Act, had a Climate Action Council that was formed that had numerous consultants developing a scoping plan and what we called the integration analysis to identify the load forecast and a couple of ranges and a couple of options of a load forecast between now and 2040 over the last few years. So we had a pre-designed load forecast ready for us basically at the start of this process that we were able to kind of just take off the shelf. That development timeframe was over a year. And so if for those of you who might not have a very granular load forecast that goes out 10, 15, 20 years, that is something definitely to consider. I think the last presenter just showed, most of the first year is just getting the data and seeding the model. And that's exactly what we found. It's very difficult to make sure everything is in there and accurate and believable and ready to run. So that's probably the most important part of this whole thing. If it's a little less peaky, if you have more load flexibility or more energy efficiency, the entire next 5 stages of the planning process is completely different. And so starting with that load forecast is really important. That model, like I said, was already pre-set up by the NISO as part of their economic planning department. So we have all the most recent information about the existing generation mix. Another very important part of this whole process, I'm going to go into a little bit more on the next slide, is what are we putting in there as options in the model for system expansion? Those new generators, what are they going to cost? What does a battery cost in 2037? These are the type of information that we have to come up with and the decisions that have to be made. Just an unending amount of decisions that we've had to make and in making this model. We also had to input a forecast of how many of these loads are expected to have DERs sited near them, how many front of the meter DERs are we expected to have on the distribution network, how much load flexibility and where is it coming from, how flexible is it? Is it something that can just disappear? You don't even have to do it that day. Is it something that can cycle over 4 hours, like maybe heating and cooling? Is it managed charging where you can actually shift it by an entire 12 hours, like don't charge it during the day, just charge it overnight? All these decisions have to be made as well. And then an important piece of this also, I know I had mentioned earlier that we're not necessarily optimizing for all of the new transmission projects in the capacity expansion model, but what we did have in there is a system representation showing that on that zonal basis, the wholesale market basis, so New York State broken up into 11 separate zones. On that zonal basis, we have the interzonal transmission capability built into there. We have external territories like ISO New England and Canada and PJM built into there. And we also have within the zones, we have what we're terming headroom, which is the amount of renewables that can be added. And that requires some definition that I might get into later, but the amount of headroom that you have in that zone, how many megawatts can you add before you have to start purchasing extra interconnection capability, essentially. We also seeded the model with a couple of unique inputs that help solve some of the uncertainty that's on this slide. Some of the unique ones, those unique inputs that I was talking about for New York State, starting with the new generators. We spent a lot of time before this process actually kicked off with NYSERDA developing a renewable energy supply curve for land-based wind, offshore wind, and solar that went all the way down to a parcel level analysis using GIS information, wind speed, solar installation, all this good stuff to identify the magnitude, the quantity, the cost, location of all of these different resources on a county by county basis in resource blocks. And so we were able to seed the supply curve with some very, very granular information about what resources at what cost are likely available to make sure that we can track where these resources are going on a zonal basis, why they were chosen, and if there's more expensive resources showing up in a certain zone, that's an indication that there might be some congestion happening or some overloads that likely or an inefficient grid mix and needs to be solved with a bulk solution. Headroom I was just talking about, we seeded the model with just a megawatt quantity of headroom in each zone, how many resources can be added before you need to start doing an upgrade. But we also wanted to make sure that wasn't just a cap on the renewable resources, because we knew we were already going to have to build intrazonal capability to even get a lot of these resources on and off the system to meet load. And so for that input, we put $1 per kilowatt cost to increase that headroom within the zone. And that cost actually increases by 15% for every extra gigawatt that we add to that. We find that New York State, we end up building 70, 80, 90 gigawatts of new resources all the way across the state. And so in almost every single zone, we're adding significant quantities of new headroom. So that's a huge signal for us that local upgrades are going to be incredibly important. But we also see some, especially upstate to downstate, some really intriguing possibilities for increasing transfer capability from upstate New York into the high density areas in downstate. We also have a really kind of interesting take in our capacity expansion model on hydrogen production. We actually are endogenously modeling electrolyzer operation. We expect that hydrogen or something like it will probably be needed to meet our high density loads downstate and to meet peaks. Based on a lot of the analysis we've done, we can't necessarily just do it with wind, solar, and storage. And so this hydrogen endogenous model also has kind of an iterative approach where it's optimizing the base level of electrolysis from our load forecast, but it's also choosing whether to increase electrolysis to then put it into fuel cells or combustion turbines to actually run into the electricity sector. So there's kind of a two-phase hydrogen approach there that's kind of interesting. And then we also have some flexible loads in the model that essentially operate as like zero cost, 100% efficient batteries that can be shiftable by as many as 4, 6, 12 hours, depending on the assumption there. So that's some of the unique things we've tried to build in there so that we have in any given representative day in the capacity expansion model, we have a really good sense of what's happening. So when we pick that up and actually put it in a nodal model, the utilities can have a little bit more assurance that they're putting in something that's likely to be more accurate, and they don't have to do all that post-processing to say, I know this is the mix, but it's probably going to behave like this on the days that matter to us. So the outputs that we're getting, like I said before, we're optimizing that supply curve to pick the best resources, that match the load forecast as best we can, coming out with the least cost mix of generation and headroom. It's optimizing the operation of storage during a day, the dispatch of flexible resources, it's optimizing electrolysis, and it's also adding that additional headroom. And jumping back, it's really interesting to see the model jump back and forth between zones. It adds in here until it runs out of headroom, and then there's a cost, so it starts adding resources over here, and then there's a cost there, so it jumps back. So that's kind of a really interesting result to watch play out. The things that we don't have in the model that are being optimized yet, it's more relying on sensitivities than an iterative approach, is trying to optimize that DER mix. The capacity expansion model can essentially be thought of as like a 230 kV and above model, because it's only representing the high level wholesale market zones and the interfaces between those zones. And so when a resource is picked, say in zone C or something near Syracuse, New York, it might say you added 1,000 megawatts of storage in zone C. But then that's up to us to determine where that actually goes, and that's a huge uncertainty in the model when we hand that information over to the utilities. So in future phases, we're trying to work on that to where the model's seeing the difference between whether that would be chosen as a distribution resource or a bulk resource. But right now, that's one of the really important kind of difficult decisions post-processing that we still have to make. We have run some sensitivities on forcing distribution resources to be allocated as distribution resources. So running a base case, finding out that there's 10,000 megawatts of storage, then running a second case where that storage is basically forced in as a load modifier with a certain shape on the distribution network in a certain area, and rerunning the model to test what that storage looks like basically as a distribution resource. Same with solar. We've done a couple of things with solar, trying to increase the amount of distributed solar hard-coded in the model. What does that load shape look like in those different areas, and see how that changes the mix of resources built. Bulk interfaces, I think Plexos actually has this capability, but right now we are just doing sensitivities, relaxing certain bulk interfaces, seeing how the grid mix changes, and seeing if we can kind of zero in on where the highest congestion and pain points are in the New York State transmission system. My wish list is a lot longer than this, but these are kind of the three main things that, as the system planner for New York State, trying to answer the question, what specific generation, transmission, and distribution resources do we need to build to hit zero carbon electricity by 2040 reliably? I think we're getting there, and we're going to have a really good start, and we're probably going to have enough information to make the first batch of decisions. But I don't think the final result here gives me enough confidence to say we definitely know the final answer for 2040 yet. I think there's a lot of things that I'd rather see in a model to optimize that, especially on the distribution side and some of the bulk interface side, to give me a little bit more confidence that I know all the permutations and what I might be missing with this current process that we have today. So the first thing I'd like to see is kind of engaging with the Plexos model a little bit more to do what we're doing with headroom, but doing that on the interzonal constraints as well, allowing the model to endogenously choose to increase bulk interfaces. We're going to have to find a way to cost that out, see what that does to operations and performance in the model, but having the model be able to choose that and optimize that would be really helpful, I think, for us to see how that works. Co-optimizing with distribution resources would be great as well. There's a couple of ways to simplify that, I'd say. We could build in different costs, maybe change the headroom cost, make a 2 headroom cost within a zone, one for adding distribution resources, one for bulk. There's a couple of things we're experimenting with, but we're still kind of figuring out how that might work. But it requires a lot more data, and some of the test runs we've been exploring take a heck of a lot more time, and we're already majorly strapped for time, so that's going to be kind of difficult. Another thing that would be difficult, because the time and the modeling resources, is really trying to get to as close to full chronology as possible, even if it's only a couple weeks at a time, representative weeks or representative days being strung together. Because without this full chronology and these capacity expansion models that might just be running representative days or sequencing certain important days together, what we end up losing is visibility on storage operation first and foremost. And also, if you're shifting all that around, you're losing the concept of kind of repetition and persistence in flexible resources, shifting seasonal storage, electrolysis. If you're only making a decision one day at a time, it kind of mutes the benefits of all of those resources. We also are not able to really endogenously model any long duration storage, anything basically above 8-hour storage, because once you go beyond that, you need more than 24 hours to do a whole cycle. And so that's been kind of tough for us to try to think about how to maybe post-process some results to find the costs and benefits of long duration storage as well. The way we're looking at storage so far is, in a representative day representation, we have to choose the starting state of charge or a flexible state of charge for the beginning of the day, and no matter what you choose, there's some downsides, and there's not really any optimization between the days. The storage is basically starting and ending at the same state of charge. Once again, we've explored how to string those together, but as soon as you string more than one day together, the processing time on the modeling is taking a heck of a lot longer than we need it to actually be useful to us. So in my optimal world, there'd be one model that goes, all the way down to the distribution network, full chronology, at least for important weeks of the year, there's a little more flexible, can look at long duration storage and also optimize all the load flexibility and electrolysis and all that good stuff that we need looked at in a world where we're actually trying to hit zero carbon. That's pretty much everything I have today. I want to leave some time for questions. I know I went pretty fast and didn't get too specific on a lot of things, so happy to take some questions now. And I left my contact information here because I'm really interested in hearing what other people think.
Thank you so much, Schuyler, for really sharing your practical workarounds and shortcuts and how you get past some of these computational issues and modeling issues. So Lee Yu asks, how is extreme weather considered in this process?
Yes, so we're really not able to capture that in the capacity expansion model. We are exploring how to run one of our sensitivities in the production cost modeling to test a couple of different extreme issues. Extreme weather can do a couple of things. It can either lead to outages, and you could test it in the form of outages, or you could test it in the form of extreme weather changes that result in dampening of any renewable generation. So there's a couple of different ways we could test extreme weather, and we're looking to do that in the production cost model, because there's not really a great way to do that in capacity expansion without getting really strange results that like double or triple the amount of solar chosen, or completely ignoring wind because the extreme weather scenario makes it useless for an important week or something. So we're trying to do that in a production cost model.
Mm-hmm. And Sammy asks, what is the drive or motivation to reduce the frequency of the study to less than 3 years? If the recommendations change more frequently, won't this add challenges to actually develop and build the recommended projects?
I see. Yes, I think there's one point of clarification is the cycles build on each other. And so as soon as we finish one cycle and the Public Service Commission is making a determination about which batch of those recommended projects we move forward with, those projects, as soon as they're approved, are baked into the future cycles. And so every cycle builds on itself. So everything that's approved becomes certain. And so the level of certainty, the amount of resources that is certain, keeps increasing. And it's not necessarily adding extra, confusion or uncertainty to the model by reopening the toolbox. Like we're not just reopening the whole process again to study it. We plan on making decisions, for example, like increasing this bulk interface by 1,000 megawatts because we plan on seeing 4,000 or 5,000 megawatts of solar in this zone. If we make that decision, we're funding that, we're recovering those costs, we're immediately going into engineering construction, and we're going to update our procurements to make sure we get the renewable resources that are going to feed that upgrade. And so we're trying to do this thing where everything builds on each other to maintain that type of certainty, because I totally agree. If we were just doing the cycle every 2 years and opening the whole thing up again, we might realize, load changed, we didn't need that power line or something like that. But we're trying to, create the future as we go to it.
Okay, great, thanks. And Sammy, just thank you for that too. So that was all the questions. Thank you so much, Schuyler. I really appreciate, sharing your actual on-the-ground practices there. I'd next like to turn over to Obadiah Bartholomy from the Sacramento Municipal Utility District. Obadiah is also the chair of our DER working group, so he's helping to oversee and lead the integrated planning work that we're doing. He's going to talk about incorporation of DER contributions into resource planning.
Thank you very much, Debbie, for the opportunity to present here today. There's been some excellent presentations. So I want to talk about SMUD's view on DERs and capacity expansion. Here's a quick snapshot of what topics I'll cover briefly: our zero carbon plan, and then I'll get into our RPP tools, data and processes, and then how we're incorporating DERs into those, and finish off on thinking about how pricing relates into this mix. So just a quick snapshot of SMUD. We've got about 645,000 customers, about a population of about 1.5 million people, or public power utility in this central region of California. We, in 2021, adopted a zero carbon plan. There were 4 primary pillars of that plan. The first pillar was repurposing our natural gas generation. We've got about 1,000 megawatts of natural gas that we're looking to retire some of and replace with renewables and storage, and then retool some of those plants as well to operate in a more flexible manner. We've got significant investments in solar and wind and storage as kind of proven clean technology categories, as well as geothermal. And then a big focus on new technology and business models. We've got a heavy amount of electrification as part of the plan, and looking to virtual power plants, which I'll speak to in this presentation, to help us close the gap to getting to zero. And the last pillar is really around maximizing our community benefits, making sure we're not leaving any customers behind in this transition. So our integrated resource planning process at SMUD has been around since the 1980s. It's mostly been an internal process up until about 2015, when SB 350 was passed, which required a public filing with the CEC, the Energy Commission in California, every 5 years. So we've now filed 2 of those, our first in 2019, and then more recently an update that was consistent with our zero carbon plan. And then we're eyeing a 2026 start on our next round of integrated resource plan to meet that requirement. These plans have 3 main pillars: costs and affordability, and environment and equity, and reliability and safety guiding them. So just briefly on our IRP modeling process, we start with capacity expansion modeling, which looks for a least cost portfolio. Using, in the past, we've used Resolve, and more recently Cerebum, and looking forward, likely to use Plexos as our capacity expansion modeling tools. That feeds into a reliability study, looking at our loss of load probability model that provides a robust perspective on our electric system reliability, and matches a 17.5% planning reserve margin. We use Recap and Cerebum as our main reliability analysis tools in the resource plan process. And then finally, production cost modeling using Plexos has been our primary tool of choice for that aspect of planning. So drilling a little bit deeper into the capacity expansion modeling topic, our zero carbon plan that I mentioned was created using Resolve, and we had to put in place a number of different constraints to make sure that we got really realistic assumptions or results, excuse me. And those were around new resource potential, GHG constraints on our thermal generation and purchases, as well as constraints on our demand side assumptions around demand response, and behind the meter battery dispatch assumptions, and finally our RPS requirements. Usually these are refined through an iterative process, so we might make adjustments to resource costs and system reliability based on results of these capacity expansion modeling results. And you can see there's a pretty wide variety of model inputs summarized below, and I'll kind of dive into a little bit more of kind of the forward look on how we're thinking about DERs and the inputs into this in a couple of slides here. So we've, I'll share a couple of recent analyses we've done looking at DER consideration in a capacity expansion context, and then talk about some of the things we're thinking about looking forward. So in 2021, as part of our zero carbon plan, we took a deeper dive with E3 on the role of virtual power plants in our zero carbon plan and what we could actually do in terms of displacement of those. I'll talk on the next slide about the methodology, but the high level results of this assessment were that there were about 1.7 gigawatts of VPP resources that were selected in the resolve modeling to meet our 2030 need. We displaced geothermal, wind, and some pumped hydro and front-of-meter batteries with the VPP resources, which was interesting. I'll talk about how that was in a second here. Well, actually, I'll just mention it now. You know, a significant share of these VPP capacity were provided by managed charging and vehicle to grid, and those were seen as very flexible resources with the potential to move energy across several days based on the flexibility of the larger format batteries prevalent in EVs today. That's something that we're still exploring in our pilot programs to see what kind of potential there may actually be for multi-day shifts. But that was how we got at some of the longer duration types of assets, such as pumped hydro and the displacement modeling. We also got additional kind of daily flexibility, which was helpful for integrating solar. In total, this simulation saved about $1.7 billion in system costs by avoiding some of these more expensive resources and reduced our average rate by about a penny a kilowatt hour, assuming these VPPs were available. So that you can see it went down from 17.5 cents to about 16.5 cents per kilowatt hour. And we did also explore energy capacity as well as ancillary services benefits. So summarizing the approach there, first off, we were taking a look at our avoided cost streams to kind of get a clearer understanding of what the VPPs could potentially displace. Then we stepped into calculating the resource costs of those. This really looked at trying to match the customer benefits if they were to dispatch these resources themselves, as well as what was required to convince the customer to invest in the resource. We didn't get into how much we might have to pay to engage the customer who had the resource to engage with us. So that's something that we're exploring through our pilot programs. We looked pretty significantly at technology characteristics. I mentioned the vehicle space and the prevalence of V1G and V2G. So really important there was understanding driving characteristics and utilization characteristics of those assets, as well looking at things like DR potential for HVAC and heat pump water heaters. And then the step 4 was feeding that into the system capacity expansion modeling, using our 2030 carbon goal case and exploring the resolve functionality for demand response resources. So those were kind of high-level summary of the methodology used to come up with the results I summarized on the previous slide. More recently, as we've been looking at different VPP offerings, in particular, this one was some modeling we were doing for a commercial VPP behind the meter storage, about megawatt scale devices going in with large commercial customers. So we looked at the trade-offs between a 2-hour and a 4-hour resource on the VPP side as compared to utility scale, and this was done using Servum with Astrape Consulting. So this is just showing the declining ELCC value over time and the difference between 2-hour and 4-hour resources. And what we saw was that the forced outage assumption was really a key differentiator between utility scale and VPP. We don't have enough experience with this size of commercial battery to have a clear picture of the forced outage rate. So we assumed about 95% versus 99% as what we've observed for utility scale storage. So that was really a key difference between the orange and blue lines. And then you can see that the 2-hour value actually retained a pretty significant share of the capacity value as compared to 4-hour, which was really important for us as we thought about engaging with commercial customers and incentive structures there. It's really guiding us towards more of a 2-hour type of resource for these assets rather than 4-hour, even though the incremental cost of going to a 4-hour was not that significant. It was only about a 30% increase in cost. But the difference in capacity value actually still guided us towards a 2-hour resource. This is kicking off today. Or this month, we have our integrated distribution resource plan update kicking off. So here we're really focused on digging into transportation electrification growth, the associated grid impacts, and then understanding how flexibility in those assumptions, as well as the role of DERs in mitigating those grid impacts, can help us. When we dug into this from a purely EV perspective, most recently, we found looking out to 2040, in order to serve about 50% more energy, which is anticipated for demand for electrification by 2040, we would need to upgrade something like 40% of the substations on our system at a cost of over $1 billion above our baseline cost. And managed charging was able to cut that about in half, but still that's really a massive investment for us. So this IDRP is allowing us to kind of dig in deeper into that with better granularity and assumptions around the flexibility on these fleets in particular, as well as the role of DERs in helping with that. We are digging in a bit in this to understand shared use analysis between distribution and bulk system use cases. And that's really being done to inform what is the scale of the challenge we're facing ahead of us for distribution investments. I mentioned that substation build or upgrade number. That's well above any kind of historical rate for us for substation projects. So it would have implications for staffing and budgets well beyond what we're used to. It also helps, though, for us to clarify the opportunity and value for load flexibility and storage solutions, which has a feedback into the virtual power plant program design. So it's really critical for us to get that right so that we can start to scale those programs and realize some of the benefit that I alluded to in the original E3 analysis we had done. And the work I mentioned is launching this month. We're working with E3 and Integral Analytics on updating this. So in thinking about our upcoming IRP, which will start in 2026, we're really focused on how we can capture the benefits of avoiding distribution system upgrades. In that, this chart shows some of the alignment of our distribution substation peaks with our system peak, which happens in hour ending 17. So you can see the vast majority of our distribution substations peak in this window and would be suitable candidates for shorter duration storage, having potentially dual benefits between our distribution system and bulk system peak. This is a snapshot of today. Obviously, that IDRP will help us overlay these future loads and help us think about how these distribution substation peaks may shift while thinking about as well future solar and storage adoption by customers that will play a role there. We're looking at pretty rapidly falling costs for batteries, creating a really big opportunity for us to put those batteries on the distribution system, either behind the meter, as I mentioned, leveraging the existing customer interconnection, or on the distribution side, just bolstering our flexibility on our system and avoiding local upgrades. And as I mentioned, really understanding how we can displace both local and bulk system capacity is critical. But further beyond that, not just bulk system capacity purchases, but bulk system storage. So thinking about the various benefits that bulk system storage can provide us and how local investment in storage can actually displace multiple grid services that are enabled by bulk system storage. for us in the capacity expansion modeling, this is really going to require new approaches to thinking about the uncertainty in the hours that the local peaks are going to occur and the year in which upgrades would be required, so that as well as the confidence that we'll have in being able to avoid those upgrades. All those are going to be likely discounting the local value that we would attribute to storage, but I'm pretty optimistic as we're already seeing a business model where local storage looks to be on the verge of competitive with utility scale storage without any of those local benefits today. All right, the last topic I was going to touch on is pricing and its relationship to resource planning. Our time of day rates for residential customers were defaulted to all customers in 2019. They have a 3-to-1 peak to off peak ratio and a 3-hour peak window, which was really valuable for us in seeing capacity displacement and getting behavioral response with that shorter duration window. We initially were scoping out a 4 to 7 window, but we're predicting solar growth to likely push that out in time, and so put in place a later window, which has been very helpful. We've got about 90%, 97% of customers who have stayed on the rate so far, and they're actively saving about 130 megawatts of demand during hot days, which is about 4% of our peak, or about 10% of residential demand. That's pretty huge for us. If you think about, the cost of what we would have had to invest if we were displacing that amount of capacity with bulk storage, we're talking about, potentially over $130 million, probably reaching towards 150 to 200 million, depending on when that investment would have been made in capacity, not to mention all of the local effects as that savings is happening at the meter. So really a tremendous investment for us. We spent, I think, about $15 million implementing the rate. So saving that kind of money on the capacity side is pretty impressive. One other thing I'll mention is the off-peak rates for us, which are about 61% of the hours, are pretty supportive of electrification, averaging about 11.8 cents per kilowatt hour currently. This is just a snapshot of what that looks like in savings. So the 2023 gray line is kind of what we saw most recently last summer. The 2017 there is the kind of pre-time of day savings, and we've continued to monitor this and observes ongoing savings off of our peak each year as a result of the TOD rate. Just a couple last thoughts about why it's important to be thinking about pricing as we're thinking about resource planning. I didn't mention commercial yet, but we did transition our commercial rates beginning in 2019 to incorporate a low daytime price due to solar growth. That's really critical in terms of aligning that commercial VPP and behind the meter storage and what we would have to pay customers to access that resource. So getting your rates right really sets up their avoided cost for or opportunity cost for participating in these VPPs and getting the most out of those assets. Unfortunately, our residential rates still don't reflect that low daytime value in them, but we're optimistic we'll be able to do that in the near future. Mostly it's been weighed against the complexity of making changes to those rates and our customers having an understanding of those changes. I'll mention our EV rates are another one we're really zeroing in on. Currently, those are a 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. Discount, and they're driving a pretty significant winter early morning peak beginning in about 2030, 2031. And we already know that's not ideal from a capacity investment requirement. It's going to drive a need for additional storage to serve that overnight peak, as was seen from the recent Stanford study last year. The last comment I'll make, we've had a lot of dialogue around dynamic rates and their role as we think about this and whether they could be incorporated into planning to better align customer load with the resource need. They do seem to provide the potential for better load responsiveness, but there's still a huge amount of uncertainty for planners around how many customers would adopt the rate, whether customers will stay on the rate, and thus how much value we can place in that rate. So these are all part of the ongoing dialogue we're having across these topic spaces. And I will wrap.
Thank you so much, Obadiah. I'm always impressed by how forward-looking and visionary SMUD is. There's a question from Bryan. For electric vehicle value in the VPP, is that largely level 2 chargers? And how does that match current trends at the residential and commercial scales?
Yeah, it was largely managing level 2 chargers, Brian. Although we also saw a significant share of vehicle to grid in that forecast. That was back in 2021. I would say we were a bit more optimistic about the pace of vehicle to grid coming on in 2021 than what we've actually observed. The costs for accessing that resource seem to be quite a bit higher than we anticipated at that time. And we just haven't seen the uptake there. So yeah, a good chunk of that was just level 1 managed charging though, and shifting that across hours and across even days. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Obadiah. I'd next like to turn it over to Aaron Burdick from E3, who's going to do the wrap up.
Okay, great. Thank you, Debbie, and thank you so much for everyone's attention, and particularly to our esteemed group of speakers. Really impressed by all the work that folks are doing, and it's great to see sort of the diversity of thought and application of a lot of these different questions for integrated planning. So in case you just joined, we heard from Bryan on an overview of how to think about bridging this T&D wall between the bulk grid and distribution planning. We heard from Chris Clack on how incorporating that into wisdom can potentially change the planning solution. We heard from Luke Falla from AEMO on their process and how spatially granular transmission constraints can support integrated planning. We heard from Schuyler Matteson on the emerging New York process, how the key design decisions are being made there, and then from Obadiah from SMUD on the utility perspective on some of the practical considerations for walking the path with VPPs and pricing. So I want to just close out by sharing a bit about our integrated planning task force that Debbie mentioned earlier. So I am Aaron Burdick, Director of Integrated System Planning at E3, and I also have the privilege of leading the Integrated Planning Task Force on behalf of ESIG. And today I just want to give an overview of the work products we're developing and share a few thoughts about how we're thinking about the product focused on optimization methods for integrated planning. So we are working E3 and Encore together with the task force membership to put together these 3 white papers that will be released in the spring. So the first is an overview of integrated planning, defining what that means and describing a framework for integration. The second is an integrated planning guidebook. So this will be a set of practical recommendations for planners today to increase integration across domains. It will include a walk, jog, run approach to do so. And then the third product, most relevant to today's discussion, is about economic optimization. Here we are picking up today's discussion and focusing on the opportunities and the challenges of trying to do more within the optimization modeling component of planning. So we'll talk about how the optimization problem changes, what new data is required, what new constraints can be added, the benefits of doing so, the challenges of doing so, and then some of the practical alternatives that may be options where co-optimization presents key challenges. So a few questions that we're thinking through for this work product and how to integrate basically transmission, distribution, and customers into the existing optimal generation expansion problem. So we want to understand what integrations are most critical for determining the holistic planning solution. We want to understand how much we can feasibly squeeze into the capacity expansion problem and what simplification methods may be required to do so. And then third, are there alternatives to this full system co-optimization, such as model iterations, that can effectively capture these critical domain interactions? So when we think about the generation capacity expansion problem, we have to understand that we're already making trade-offs just to solve the generation problem. So we have to trade off spatial granularity, temporal granularity, operational detail, grid physics, representation, and the amount of resource options that we consider. So we have a set of ways to do that now that have been developed in the generation planning space. The question is, if we want to do integrated planning, that's going to likely increase our need to capture more spatially granular inputs, better representation of some of the grid physics, and then additional resource options. So how do we think about expanding in those areas? Are there simplifications that we need to make? How are we going to increase a problem that is already requiring us to shrink the problem size to solve feasibly? So in our work product for the task force, we'll be looking at the benefits of doing co-optimization and the challenges of doing so. So the benefits, as we've talked about today, are really to be able to endogenously identify the right investment opportunities. So where to build the transmission lines, where to site storage, how much should we be building out bulk grid versus distributed resources. The goal of doing this endogenous optimization is to lower the total cost solution and hopefully to have fewer iterations between our planning models. Some of the challenges are it's going to require a lot of new data and a lot of new compute to run a more complex problem. And we still may not be able to fully eliminate some of the iterative processes. So we want to understand what's the limit of economic optimization. What do we want to still capture in downstream or upstream models? So the question really is how much we can put into this optimization problem versus how much we should continue to do in upstream and downstream studies. That's a preview of what we'll be working on, and really appreciate the contributions from the speakers today, that their presentations will inform this work product. Thank you very much. I will hand it back to the ESIG team to close us out.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time and your questions and engagement. And we are going to send out a email to everyone with a link to the slides and a link to the recording. So thanks again to all the speakers, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.